In October of 2023, I had an idea for a cool new project. I had just finished this render, where I took a frame from the trailer for the Continental series, based on the John Wick movies, and recreated it in 3D using Blender. I really liked how it turned out and wanted to do more of these kinds of CGI movie scene recreations. So, as I finally tried to catch up with the Loki series on Disney Plus a few weeks later, I was delighted to come across this scene. The retro-futuristic, slightly brutalistic atmosphere immediately captured my fascination, and I decided that this would be my next subject. I started grabbing still frames and other reference photos, organizing them in PureRef. I matched the camera perspective from the original frame using fspy, and by rebuilding the first few assets, I was well on my way to make another beautiful cinematic picture in Blender. And then I got a new job, went on a few vacations, wrote and published my first novel, and somehow the project just never got finished. Until a few days ago, when I just randomly stumbled upon the old project folder on a hard drive I hadn't checked for a few months, and thought, you know what? Might be fun to give it a second try. So I did. I started by rematching the camera from the original shot, because, as I could recall, I hadn't done this step thoroughly enough last time, which led to a few problems down the line. Basically, I missed the exact measurements, which led to me having to deform the perfectly circular floor in order to fit the reference image, which in turn led to everything else based off of that floor to be crooked and out of alignment. As you'll see in my final result, the position of the clock in the center of the ceiling is still slightly off, but I did the axis calculation so meticulously this time that I am now basically convinced that the original set the scene was shot in just wasn't perfectly symmetrical, floating walls and all that. Then I started recreating the basic shape of the room, extruding and insetting the outer edge of the floor to create cupboards, counters, and the basic wall, which would later be replaced by more detailed assets. I left out the ceiling for the time being so I'd have easier access to the interior I was working on, but before deleting it, I used it to mark the space where the clock would be located, so I could then place all those cylindrical wooden lamps around it. With those simple placeholders, I now had a depth reference which gave me the approximate position and size of all the more intricate elements of the scene. I started by modeling the illuminated signs above the pie compartments, duplicating parts of the wall to maintain the proper curvature. I found this font on 1001freefonts.com, which is a website that offers, amongst some paid products, a bunch of really high-quality public domain fonts. I quickly matched the size and spacing of the letters to the reference in the free and open source painting tool Krita, put a light source instead of the sign, and moved on. One of the few things that had actually turned out pretty well the first time I approached this project were all the small compartments inside the walls that each held a single piece of green lemon cake. I was able to basically reuse the models I had made 2 years prior, although a friend of mine pointed out to me that yes, indeed, the poly count was ridiculously high for a small, high-distance asset. So I made sure that all pieces of cake were instances of each other rather than unlinked copies, before simplifying them, which reduced the poly count of my scene quite significantly. Piece of cake. After that, I distributed the modular pieces with the cake compartments along the wall, using the reference image as a guide for where to add blank spaces in between every 5 columns. Once again, I made sure that the different parts of the walls, buttons and signs were instanced to keep the scene as lightweight as possible. I made an approximation of the floor tile pattern in Krita, although I'd later replace it again, and moved on to the other assets. I modeled tables and chairs, every now and then switching between my scene and the reference image to compare the models. And then distributed them as instant copies around the whole room. I closed off the ceiling, pulling the center down and adding the basic shape of the clock. And now, with the room airtight, I got a first look at the lighting situation. Pretty noisy. I wonder if that's got something to do with the bazillion little half-obstructed light sources underneath the ceiling. Oh well. I went back to 1001 free fonts to get this font, which I used to recreate the retro-style oval clock. After cleaning up the geometry a bit, I added the little dotted rim around the edge of the dial, as well as all the hands in the world. Looking good, on to the details. I built some low-poly sugar sprinkler and napkin holder, which would be very small in the final picture, so I didn't bother too much. And I put them everywhere. Next was lighting and colors. I cut holes into the top of the pie signs to create the light fall off on the wall as seen in the reference still image, and I started matching some of the colors in the scene a little closer. I remapped the brightness values of the floor onto a color RAM so I could adjust the tint and brightness of each of the 3 colors without having to leave Blender. Just like with most of the rest of the scene, I decided not to use any PBR texture maps until later on, when I'd be able to see how much they'd even show up in the wide angle shot with added film grain. And then of course I forgot to even check. At one point I realized I hadn't put any doorknobs into the cabinets yet, so I quickly distributed them around the scene. After that, I took a moment, watching my scene and the reference I wanted to recreate side by side, checking for any inconsistencies. Or at least the ones above my personal error tolerance, which is pretty generous. Now, I know the scene is still missing a crucial element, but if you seriously think that I'd invest another 2 hours to collect reference, go into Character Creator, whip up the most nightmare-inducing digital doubles for Owen Wilson and Tom Hiddleston, loosely matching their hairstyle and clothes, and then posing them just like in the base picture, you're absolutely right, that's exactly what I did. I also made a fork. From scratch. Because why not? Misjudged the size a little bit at first, so I corrected that. Since at that point I was not happy with the floor tile pattern shifting so much whenever I switched between the base image and my scene, I scrapped it and built a new floor, based on the exact positions of my geometry within the frame. I put an array modifier onto it for a whole row, and then another one to fill in the whole floor. I noticed that the cylindrical part of the ceiling in the middle of the room had some interesting low-intensity reflection pattern on it, so after temporarily forgetting everything about UV mapping and shaders I'd learned in the last 10 years of using Blender, I managed to come up with this. Close enough. I put some fake glass into the 2 visible frames of the clock dials and moved on into the compositor. Following the path of the light through each logical step of optical effects, I consecutively added some subtle lens distortion, a glare node, and a blur filter. The original picture had some black letterboxes, so I put some into the composition as well. I did some minor color curves adjustment, and then I downloaded some free film grain textures to overlay onto my render, to give it back a little of that analog quality. Then I decided that Loki's trousers were too long and sliced them into shortened them. And then it was finally time for the render. Which took about 30 minutes, because I just couldn't be bothered to optimize the scene any further and instead decided to let my GPU do all the heavy lifting for me. I just chose a ridiculously high image resolution. Take that, noise. I took the render back into Krita again, did some small shadow touch-ups, crashed the program twice because Freihandpinselstrich, and after removing a little speck of whatever the hell this is from Mobius' shoulder, I was finally done. So yeah, that's my final render. Is it perfect? No. Do I like it? Yes. Am I happy that I managed to pick up the project a second time and finish it? You're goddamn right I am. I had a ton of fun making this, and most notably, making a lot of mistakes along the way. Because I'm a big fan of the whole you first need to know all the rules so you can break them philosophy, and oh boy did I break them during this project. Not in an avant-garde artistic decision kind of way, but in a I know that's probably idiotic but I also know it'll work regardless kind of way. Sometimes trying not to do everything as perfect as possible can be really liberating. In this case, so much so that I, for once, don't feel completely exhausted after having finished the project. Maybe there is something to learn here. Or maybe not. I don't care. Did you like the final result? Let me know in the comments. Bye!